Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay I'd like to talk about politics and do checks and balances actually work. Checks and balances in the United States, as an example, the dividing up the power between the courts and the legislature, the House of Review and the executive. I suppose it works in part, but as we see it at the moment, with pretty much all of these organs of government being infiltrated by the globalists, that it's not really working. There isn't a check or a balance or restriction on the globalists and their behaviour, but there is a restriction on those who may question, doubt, or oppose the globalists. So, in the sense, the government that is for the people and by the people has been hijacked by other interests, and the checks and balances that were designed and put in place to stop this very type of thing from happening, among other things, such as tyranny of the majority and that sort of stuff, they're clearly not working, or at least in my view, they're not working. So let's have a look at checks and balances. Do they work? What sort of checks and balances can work, and why are checks and balances not working currently in pretty much the whole Western world? So going back to the types of democracy and just having a look at that. So there are things such as direct democracy, which is the citizens directly voting for something that's put on the agenda. Now, there's still an elite that will control what you can vote on, but then direct democracy tends to involve only those citizens with the biggest stake in society, the landholders and people who have various civic duties and so on. So, say in the case of ancient Athens, you had somewhere around 25%, give or take, of the adult male population that could vote in direct democracy. Now, not all of them turned up to vote. They could, but not all of them did. And the issues would range from going to war, where you'd imagine everyone would turn up to vote, or allocating funds for public works. You want to extend the port facilities, then there's a vote on that because it's going to cost money. So the people would vote on things that mattered to them, but in terms of total eligible voters, again, it was around 25. Some even say it was as high as 28% of the adult males. Now, again, the idea was responsibility. The responsibilities that you took were a reflection on how much say you had in government. So only adult males could go to war. Therefore, only adult males had a vote. It was the taxes of adult males that were allocated to public works. Therefore, the adult males had a vote, and so on. So these were some of the considerations, not unreasonable at the time, not unreasonable even today. Now, if we look at, say, the Roman situation, where you had more of a representative type democracy. And when I say democracy, I use it generically as the right to vote. Voting had a role in determining the government of a society. Now, was it universal franchise in either Athens or Rome or anywhere else for that matter? No. Was it a restricted franchise? Yes. Did you have a choice of which candidates you voted for? No. Now, in the Roman case, a lot of people could put their hand up to say, well, I want to stand for public office of some sort, whether it be the Senate or the People's Assembly and the tribunes of the people and so on. But there was a series of magistrates, as they called them in Rome, that would, for every office, there was typically only 2 candidates were allowed to stand. There were some exceptions to that, but the magistrate would trim the list down. If say for a particular office there were 10 candidates, the magistrate would then look at those and say, well, these 2 are the ones that I will allow to go on. So there was restrictions in that sense, and the elites were able to pick their own people or their own flunkies, as the case may be. So there were limitations in that sense. Now, the ballot or the voting wasn't compulsory. So in some areas and districts, given that there were a lot of people who didn't care, that there was only one vote cast, which was for the candidate themselves. So that and you can imagine that was a source of great mirth back in the day, as it would be now. So what people standing for public office did, who were usually the better off, they would bribe people to come and vote. Uh, Not because they were bribing as in their voting intention was being corrupted, but just so some people, at least a decent showing of people would turn up and cast a ballot. Now, the corruption would vary. Out of a population, and like say in Italy, there was a population of around 6.5 million or so in 70, I think it was 70 BC. But there was less than a million. I think around 900,000 people were eligible to vote. And again, if you look at the amount of adult males in the population, so say the adult males were probably half of the adult males in Italy had the right to vote. So that's a pretty decent, in ancient terms, that's quite a high percentage of the population, and I guess you'd say something in the order of 15%, 16, 17% or something like that of the overall population. And keep in mind that only 1 in 4 people who were born made it to the age of 50 back in the day. So that's still quite a high proportion of the adult population there that have the right to vote. Not all of them exercised it, but again, they tended to be the better off. Even if you weren't a sort of landowner, if you had a certain value of production, if you like, in the plot of land that you were leasing, that would make you eligible to vote. But again, the idea was those who had the biggest stake in the society should have the biggest say, and that's not an unreasonable thing. If you look at sort of some of the more successful statesmen of even the modern era, such as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, that was one of the things, or one of the ideas and concepts of democracy that he constantly came back to, that those with the biggest stake, and thus the highest risk, should be the ones that have the bigger say in the government and how it's run and so on. But coming back to the idea of, in the modern era at least, of checks and balances, to some extent, sharing power and having checks and balances creates discord and creates the very problems that you're trying to, anyone sort of designing, if you like, a governmental system's trying to avoid. There's a need to have a certain homogeneity in the population, and a homogeneity in accepting the rule of law, accepting the processes of how decisions are made. And if you look at the various civil wars and struggles for power that happened, even in Western Europe, but anywhere else really, it was disputes over how power was to be shared, and then what the consequences of that power sharing would be. For example, if a monarch wants to go to war, then they have to get the taxes and get the local aristocrats to raise troops and to equip those troops, provide the horses and so on. It's an expensive business. Now, in the case of, if we look at, say, Magna Carta in England, the aristocrats quite reasonably wanted the king to say, well, hey, look, buddy, if you're going to tax us and get us to engage in all these expensive things, such as getting troops and equipping them and that sort of stuff, then we'd like to have a say in things, if you don't mind. Now, the king was, back in the day, was, well, screw you, I'm doing it. But the nobles then forced Magna Carta on the king, who, by the way, later on reneged, and so they had to keep on revisiting this power sharing. Now, as we look at the concept of power sharing and thus the checks and balances, And we go through the different types of democracy. So there's direct democracy, that is, you directly vote for each item on the agenda. Again, the elites have some control over which items you're allowed to, that appear on the agenda that you're allowed to vote on. But if those who vote are those who have the highest risk and are making the biggest contribution to society, then they can overturn the elite of the elites, if you will, and say, no, we want to vote on this. So direct democracy has its place. I mean, theoretically or technically, it could be done today. If everyone has a registered voting tablet, and there are various measures in place to make sure there's not, robo voting or something like that, then people could vote on, could engage in direct democracy today. Again, it would come down to who's allowed to, what issues and topics and subjects are allowed to be voted on, and yet still elites would still be deciding that. Also, there are issues of is something local or regional. For example, do I care that if I live in Los Angeles, for example, do I care about voting for a stadium, which may be a major expense, voting for a stadium in New York? It doesn't affect me. Why should I vote? So then you get the idea of, should people be voting? Should it be compulsory? Should they only vote for regional stuff? Who decides what's something of national import, for example, going to war? And how are these things presented to the public for example, let's say we want to put hardcore lesbian studies in every high school in the United States. Now, we may not present it that way. The voters may get a message on their tablet that says, we want to create equality in the classroom. Vote yes or no. So, well, gee, equality in the classroom. But what the people who are framing this mean is, and their intent is to put hardcore, angry lesbian studies in the classroom. So there needs to be some sort of controlling of that. So even in direct democracy, you would still have corrupting influences, or potentially at least intervening. So does direct democracy work? I don't know. Could it be made to work? Possibly, but the administration of it would need to be of the highest quality, and that in turn could be corrupted. So there could be elements, such as the globalist cabal, that could get into that and just misrepresent the issue to be voted on, so they could get, well, you guys voted yes, hey, we're only doing what you wanted, but in fact they'd misrepresented, as we see now in referendum. There's a referendum going to take place in Australia to create a special parliament only for Indigenous peoples. Now, depending on the legality of whether you say one drop of Indigenous blood means you're equivalent to a full blood, or so, that's a different, it's a different debate there. But this idea that there must be a special parliament, and that's the only way to achieve harmony and balance, is beyond absurd. But there's lavish funding for the case to support this special Indigenous parliament. Lavish funding. Every advert you see is in support of it. There is not a single voice, not a single dollar, not a single advert out there that's saying, hey, this is a bad idea. It's going to divide us by race, not unite us. And there's maybe 5% of the media, if that are asking those sort of questions. Is it going to unite us or divide us? But the mainstream media totally, the entire globalist cabal is on board with. So referendums, or referenda, as in the plural, can be misrepresented. So direct democracy has its limitations, has its place as well. And we look at something like representative democracy, where people are elected. We elect local area representatives to a federal parliament or a legislature, and they then represent us. But again, we have the problem where the candidates are being selected by the elites, and we have, in the case of even multi-party politics, let alone the us and them politics of, say, Democrats and Republicans, we have the party machine, the fundraising, administrative, organisational party machines that have huge influence over what candidates are selected, where they're allowed to stand for election, whether or not their re-elections are being funded well enough or at all. There are a whole range of issues where the executive is deciding on matters that put those matters outside of the choice of the people. And more we're seeing certainly in the West, certainly in the globalist infiltrated one, more and more decisions and determinations of all descriptions are being made outside of the political process itself, as in the voting process. Now, there's a lot of people that again, I use democracy generically in the terms that the people have a right to vote to select their government, and invariably you get the people that come up, say in the United States, it's not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. But the point is, people still get the right to fucking vote, so it's still a democracy. In terms of democracy, meaning 50.01% of the people can tyrannically stick it up the other 49.99%. That's not what is meant by democracy. In terms of a constitutional republic, as in the United States, there's the legislature, as in the House of Representatives. Then there's the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators, regardless of whether they've got 50 million people or 5 million people voting, and so they still get the same. So this makes sure that the representation in the states, as in the populous and the less populous states, is kept at 2 senators each. Now, this in itself is a pretty substantial restriction on the capacity of the majority to tyrannically stand over the rest of the population. So that's an idea of or a concept of a check and a balance. Then you have a separate Supreme Court, and Supreme Court judges are selected by the executive. I don't know how good a thing it is. Should judges be elected? Because elections can be corrupted. Should they be appointed by an independent person who's elected by all the people, the president, in this case, in America? So I'm not so sure about that. But for example, the blatant politicizing of Supreme Court positions by particularly the Democrats, Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor and those people. I mean, fuck. They would be lucky to make it into a petty sessions court in the real world, but here they are sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States. But at least they're a separate entity and appointed for life, so it's much harder to get at them through bribery or these sorts of things. But it wouldn't be impossible, and I'd rather they were paid exceptionally well and with us immune from the temptation of considering or accepting bribes, and that those who may offer those bribes would realise that people that well paid aren't going to really be susceptible to it. But I think with the globalists having penetrated all levels of Western government now, it's difficult for any office holder not to be available to consider the bribery angle. Even if you're on a really good income, the reality is you might have lots of children or relatives, and they want their waterfront homes and their yachts and their Maseratis as well. And so you can get a banker or one of the big financial players, one of the big organisations, says, look, we can make sure your son, daughter is very well looked after, and but all you need to do is make a decision in this or that direction on this upcoming case. That it must happen, and we need to be realistic about that the separation of powers itself has limitations if there isn't a will to represent the people rather than represent particular interests that may wave gifts and goodies in front of you. The idea of representative democracy, whether it be two-party, as in the United States, or multi-party, as it is in most of Western Europe, is I would have thought the multi-party system would have a much higher resistance to the globalist infiltration. But in fact, it hasn't. The globalists have been just as successful infiltrating somewhere like, say, Germany or France as they have in the United States or Britain. So regardless of the whether it be representative democracy, a constitution, or a constitutional monarchy, or whatever it is, any type and all types of government have been very successfully infiltrated by the globalist cabal, regardless of how it is. So clearly, no form of government is resistant to being infiltrated and effectively taken over and turned against the people, as it has been in the Western world, by the globalist cabal. So when we look at checks and balances, we need to say, well, how do we make a political system that's representative and responsive, but also resistant to the external takeover, or even internal elements for that matter. No one envisaged this sort of situation in the West. No one envisaged that the entire British political institution could be taken over by external interests. I mean, they're so powerful now that the globalist cabal, they can actually install the person of their choice as prime minister without any vote. Not a single vote, whether it be the parliament, the party machine, the people. They can just install their candidate. That's how fucking powerful the globalists are now. I mean, holy crap! So this is something that when we consider checks and balances, our checks and balances are products of their times and situation. For example, people like Madison and Jefferson and that sort of thing, framing the United States Constitution, were satisfied with most of the laws and political structures of Britain, and that was their framework. And they looked at ancient Rome and all sorts of things, but they were pretty satisfied with it. But they thought, if we can get rid of the monarch, and if we can have one more check and balance, a couple more checks and balances put in, we'll be good to go. This will work. Now, some of Madison's thinking was when looking at the American Revolution, or the colonists, the American colonists rebelling against the British Crown, was that there were elements in Britain that in the British Parliament who were more than happy to sit down with the colonists and achieve some sort of negotiated settlement. And if it happened in the early stages of the conflict, I think there would have been a higher degree of self-government. The local assemblies in the Americas would have had the right of veto over certain taxes, that sort of thing. And that probably would have calmed things down. They probably would have gone, okay, no, that's fine. And everybody would have gone on with it. But there were elements on both sides that were spoiling for a punch-up, and of course they got it. It's interesting that once America got independence, or achieved independence, the taxes that they had to levy to make the nation viable were far, far higher than anything the British Crown had contemplated. So, it was in the early stages, at least, quite a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of winning was far, was far greater than some negotiated settlement ever could have been. But nonetheless, so Madison was thinking, how can we avoid a situation where this tyranny of the majority? And in the case of Britain, there was something like 600 plus families that controlled really all political power in Britain at the time, and some of these people, I mean, if you look at the likes of Pitt and all those sorts of things, the British political establishment produced some high quality people over this time from quite a small population. They produced, very high quality naval officers and, an excellent navy. And they did many things very, very well. Were they perfect? Of course not. Should they have been keener to sit down with the American colonists and listen to their grievances? Of course they should have. And there were elements inside the British Parliament that wanted to do this. So Madison had a view, and you can see this if you tease it out of his writings, had a view that if the majority in the British Parliament didn't have, as in the power to impose their will on everything, if they had to sit down and listen to these other elements within the British Parliament that were counselling negotiation and this sort of thing with the colonists, that if that were the case, then the war may never have happened, which would have been better for everybody, Madison divined. And Madison had if you look at the guy of his times, him, Jefferson and others, they had this I believe anyway, this view that was well ahead of its time, but suggested that there were people thinking about these sorts of things, and that these ideas, radical and revolutionary as they may have seemed, were in fact quite sensible about improving the quality of government and its responsiveness to the demands of the people. And I think to a large degree in its day, the American Constitution did achieve that. Now we come to how many people should be allowed to vote. If for my view, people under the age of 23 should not be given the vote unless they are serving their country in some frontline capacity. For example, if they're out on the front lines in warfare getting shot at, if they're people who are rushing into burning buildings to save folks, if they're people on that front line, risking their lives for the community and for the nation, then they should have the right to vote. Some 18-year-old kid, you're going to send him out with a rifle to get shot at, you give that kid the vote. That kid has got the vote because of the sacrifice they're making or are prepared to make. For other people under the age of 23, I don't believe so. So I would restrict the vote to people over the age of 23. And only citizens and people who have to be citizens for a certain amount of time. Now, people who want to be dual citizens, I want to stay as a citizen of India, and I want to also be a citizen of the United States. Then I will know, unless you renounce your Indian citizenship, you cannot have the vote. You are 100% American. And as soon as you have your American citizenship, you can't send back to the dirt poor, shithole village of your ancestors to get brides and husbands. You have to marry, assuming you want to get married, you have to marry locally. So there are certain responsibilities and duties that come with citizenship and certain benefits. One of those is the vote. But once you accept citizenship and you have the right to vote, then you also accept its obligations. You can't say, well, I got the right to vote here. By the way, I'm an Indian or I'm a, whatever. And I hate America, and you're all morally bereft. You can't have it both ways, in my view. So citizenship would have obligations and so on. And I think once citizenship has clear obligations attached to it, then it's much harder for globalists or anyone else to infiltrate. Similarly, the checks and balances, I believe, need to be revised to ensure that external forces, the globalist cabal in this case, cannot infiltrate the parliaments and for example, in the West at the moment, and certainly in Australia, politicians now derive the majority, in some cases the vast majority of their income from real estate speculation that's done in conjunction with very cozy arrangements with the big financial firms and the BlackRocks and all that sort of thing. Whereas hitherto, 25 years ago, nearly every politician was making their money out of their salary or their income from being a politician, whether it be a prime minister or whatever it might be, or judges again making their income from their salary. So if you look at a senior court judge, say he gets $550,000 a year, all cashed up in benefits and so on, they're still making, I'm thinking of one now that's made about $700,000 a year out of real estate speculation or appreciation, or a little bit more than that. So close on double the amount, whatever they're getting paid as being a judge, close on double that has been derived from real estate. So their loyalties, where do their loyalties lie? Do they, to the state, to the citizenry, to the law, to the and so on. So there are a range of things, constitutionally and legally, that we still need to do to make government functional and responsible, and to ensure that that the government remains controlled by the people, and that the vote is still sacred in terms of electing representatives and the duties and obligations of those representatives to to the people as they operate from a parliament. So, just in summary, I don't think direct democracy works unless in very specific and certain instances. I think if laws have to be changed, for example, we want to change the law to bring in millions of immigrants, then you've got to have a fucking referendum on that. That's got to be direct democracy on that one. And the body that words the referendum, the vote to be taken needs to be absolutely independent and unsullied and uncorrupted by the political process. Equivalent to, if you like, a Supreme Court or something like that. So, but the most important things, or among the most important things to protect democracy, is that the application of the law must be equally applied to all people, and due legal process must be honoured as being something that's absolutely not negotiable. Due legal process in any legal situation. But it could be a petty sessions thing where neighbours complaining about you cut my roses down, up to murder and anything at all. It has to elections, anything at all that must be legally decided that what happened, was it consistent with the law. Now, I think democracy is under threat. I think in the Western world it's been eradicated. I think all the checks and balances that did exist or have existed, most have failed. And I think if Donald Trump hadn't been elected in the United States and three constitutional judges hadn't been appointed, the Democrats would have had a runaway majority in the Supreme Court, 6-1 or something, and so they would have had their way there, and the entire legal and judicial political process would have been politicised and controlled by the globalists. And we can only thank God that Donald Trump did get elected and managed to appoint those judges, much to the annoyance of the globalist cabal. But that's the only thing. That is the only thing that is stopping the United States from sliding into complete globalist-controlled chaos. But exercise your minds, because it's not simply a case of which democracy. The Soviet Union, the communists had democracy. You could still vote for it, but you only vote for the one candidate that they said. And that candidate could only vote on the policies that the government was pursuing. So it wasn't democracy as in the democracy they represented the people and the wishes of the people, far from it. But in terms of checks and balances, the checks and balances currently pretty much don't work. In the case of Britain, as an example, they just don't work at all in any sense. And so we need to rethink what checks and balances mean, and the various obligations of citizenship. Being with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.